today I want to talk about the secret sauce when it comes to landing your first data job. There's a lot of resources online that talk about technical tools, coding, and portfolio projects, but as a hiring manager and someone who has helped almost 100 students along in their data journeys, there's always a combination of 4 key skills that I notice the most successful candidates have. So if you can focus on these 4 key skills after you have some of the technical fundamentals, you will significantly accelerate your path to going from someone who goes from feeling really impostery to someone who's actually confident that they can stand out from the stack. I'm Christine, and in this channel we talk about the strategies that can accelerate your journey to working in data. So what do you think makes the fastest first impression when a hiring manager looks at your work? Is it the complexity of your SQL or all the nested functions you used inside your Excel workbook? Or is it actually how you wrapped everything up in a bow and how you delivered it? Professional polish in this case is referring to the attention to detail that you give to the final deliverable of your work in terms of how it actually looks and how it's presented. There's 2 main areas where you're going to be able to flex your ability to have professional polish. The first one is in your actual portfolio. Hiring managers are most likely going to be skimming your project for like a few seconds. This is where you want to give the impression that the work that you've done could have been delivered directly to a stakeholder. So that's the difference between a portfolio project that looks something like this, which is really messy. It's really difficult to actually separate what's most important. And there's a lot of extra colors and a lot of extra lines and stuff that isn't actually needed, to a project that looks something like this, where the visualizations are really sleek and really clean. And it's really easy for me as a stakeholder or a manager to get right down to the so what of your project. These 2 projects could actually be the same exact project, but how you present it makes the entire difference of how your work actually comes across to someone who might be interested in hiring you. The second big opportunity to show this is in your take-home test when you actually go through the interview process. So a lot of times you might get, some kind of take-home exercise from the interviewer where you're asked to write some code, make a visualization or a dashboard, and pull out some insights. So even when you get a technical take-home, that could be the difference between dumping your queries into like a Word document with no formatting, no highlighting, and then just sending it back, to something like taking those queries, putting them in a README, even having the ERD directly in the README, and sending that back as if you were a data analyst who's actually working on the team. I had a student, Jennifer, from the 3rd cohort, who had a 7-person panel interview, which can be very intimidating, but she was asked to present a project, and so she presented a project that she did in the program, and they were so impressed not only with the actual technical work, but more so with the final deliverable and how the aesthetics of everything tied together, that afterwards they gave her an offer within 15 minutes of that interview ending. So you can see that these are the small things that really make a big difference. So here's my professional polish checklist for you guys that you should always be running through every time you wrap up a project. The first bucket is readability. Are all of the labels, the text, the axes, are those really easily readable to someone who is skimming through your project? Most of the time, it needs to be made bigger than you think it is, especially for someone who's just taking a really quick look. And have you made sure to use things like bolding and section headers and separations and line breaks to actually separate out the different categories of things that you analyzed so that someone doesn't get lost in a whole wall of text? The second category is simplicity. So getting rid of extra decimal points that just don't help you tell the story, or getting rid of things like grid lines and tick marks so that your actual visualizations look really clean and sleek. The third category is conciseness. So this is where you can use ChatGPT to just help you and make sure that your writing is really concise, to the point, and also really clear and understandable and just grammatically correct, so that when someone goes to your README or your take-home project, they can understand exactly what your insights and your process was. So let's say a data analyst job, 50% of the job is about the technical skills. What do you think the other 50% is about? It is communication. And when I talk about communication in this case, I'm just talking about the actual verbal delivery of your work. And this is the number one thing that I think makes the biggest difference when it comes to succeeding in the interview. I would say the biggest mistakes that people make are, 1, rambling, just going on and on and on about an answer without really checking to see if the other person on their side is following along. The second is getting way too detailed, way too quickly, just diving into the technical stuff before someone has really even asked about that. And also just being a little bit too stiff, sounding robotic. And it's very natural. All of those things happen when you're nervous, but all of this stuff can actually be practiced. Something I teach and that we practice is what I call degrees of detail communication, which just means being really intentional and thoughtful about what level of detail should you be communicating with based on who the other person is on the other side of the screen or the table. And so if it's another data analyst, for example, you can be a lot more technical. Or if it's a manager of a manager, someone who's really high level, for example, the director of marketing marketing for a startup. You need to be really mindful about whether or not what you're saying to them actually matters to that person. And the thing is, you're not only going to have to do this in interviews, but you're going to have to do this on the actual job where you communicate with lots of different team members across lots of different levels. And I want to read you guys this LinkedIn post from a data manager named Talha on LinkedIn. And he was doing a bunch of interviews in the last week, and this is what he says. Your communication skills matter a lot more than you think. All of the people that we interviewed were technically sound, some being extraordinary, but the way the experience was articulated and communicated made it all look slightly insignificant, even though it wasn't. Imagine expecting one elaborate answer to a question. You end up asking 6 to 7 follow-up questions to get to the answer you wanted to, which doesn't put the candidate in a good position, especially when they already have a lot of experience. It's up to you to take initiatives, work on your communication, improve your body language, and practice. I have a student named Diana who was a student in the 4th cohort that just ended a few days ago. And before the program even ended, she landed a job as a data analyst at the San Diego International Airport. And the way that she practiced was exactly this, by recording herself on Zoom, seeing which areas she needed to improve on, giving herself really direct and clear feedback and practicing it, and then actually doing mock interviews with other students where she was able to actually put all of that into action. So a few years ago, when I was interviewing for a role at Vimeo, the interviewer pulled up a list of all the statistical distributions out there and asked me which one of these distributions am I familiar with. And I completely blanked because I just didn't remember any stat stuff then. And what I did next actually saved the interview and also helped me land the role. And that is asking what I would call opportunity-driven questions. So that means instead of asking really generic questions that, are just really standard, instead using that question asking period as an opportunity to show your domain knowledge, show your enthusiasm and ability to be a data analyst, and also show your potential to grow into the role. So instead of asking really generic questions like, what's your tech stack? What's a day in the life of a data analyst on this team like? What kind of projects would I be working on? Or what are the goals of the company? You want to ask questions that belong to 3 main categories. One group of questions, which is flexing your domain knowledge. So for example, Vimeo is a SaaS business. It's a subscription as a service business. And I'm aware that some of the key metrics are blank, blank, and blank. Are there any other metrics or projects that you guys are working on that you think are quite different for a subscription as a service company? The next group of questions have to do with how you could help improve the team. So for example, a question like, as a director, what are the specific challenges or weaknesses that you see on your team, and how would you want this new data analyst to help you improve that process or help you improve that weakness? And then the last category are questions that aim to make a connection. Remember that the person who's on the other side of the interviewing table is someone you would potentially be actually working with on a daily basis. So that's asking questions like, I noticed you had a background in education before you worked in data. What was that transition like for you? And were there certain areas that were particularly challenging or surprising and certain areas that you found really fulfilling? This ability to ask really incisive and unique questions will not only help you in the interview process, but also on the job. And I always see over and over again that the students who are able to really ask a lot of questions about their learning journey and along the process are also the people who also learn the fastest. In the end, the hiring manager who I was interviewing with ended up telling me that that ability of mine to ask so many questions took that interview from a 45-minute interview to an hour-and-a-half long interview, and ultimately helped me land that role because he could tell from those questions that I was going to be someone who could also learn to do the job.
A lot of times students come into the program saying that they have these technical fundamental skills, but they're not really sure how to tie it all together, and that every time they get a new project or a new problem, they're starting from scratch. And so one of the things that really standout data analysts have is a structure or a system for how to solve different kinds of problems and how to tackle new data sets. That's where you're really building your analytical muscle. But one way you can start building your muscle for this is that every time you start a new project, instead of just starting to build the project as if it's a totally new thing, is to first think about what are all the steps that you're going to take before you actually do them, and actually create a manual for yourself. So for example, let's say you're starting new data cleaning. Instead, you might write notes like, okay, first, I'm going to put all the data into Excel, and I'm going to filter all the columns to see what the distinct values are. Then I'm going to check what all the columns are that have nulls and what are the columns that have nonsensical data. Then I'm going to calculate what are the percent of values that are affected by nulls or nonsensical data, so that I can then determine what is the priority order of the columns that I need to then fix and clean. Being able to explain this thought process in an interview gives a hiring manager a lot more trust that you're someone who can do the job and doesn't need to be handheld for every step of the way when you first start onboarding. So by building this manual, you are essentially creating a guide for yourself over time, where anytime you get a data cleaning project or an exploratory analysis project, or anytime you're trying to improve a process, you have your checklist of the things that you should be looking for and your way of onboarding onto the data set. I do have a video on the exploratory data analysis framework and the data cleaning framework that you can use to get yourself started so that you can start to feel that you have more of a system for these kinds of projects instead of starting from scratch each time. So here's a summary of everything we talked about in terms of the 4 key skills that make up this secret sauce that can really help you stand out as a data analyst. Building professional polish so you can stand out in the job market, communicating using degrees of detailed thinking, being able to ask opportunity-driven questions in the interview process, and then also learning the frameworks instead of just the techniques that are going to help orient yourself as a data analyst who goes to the job hunt and on the actual job. You can screenshot this and keep it in your study materials as a reminder as you're going through your data journey. If you want more tips like this, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.